Deputy Róisín Shortall, please.
In response to the unprecedented housing crisis that we're experiencing in this country at the moment, I believe that we're seeing the emergence of a grassroots campaign. Large numbers of people who increasingly are getting to the point where they're saying enough is enough in relation to the government's failure to address this most basic issue. The Congress of Trade Unions is spearheading the Raise the Roof campaign. This is supported by many housing charities, NGOs and a number of opposition parties. And in addition to that, over recent weeks, we have seen a great many young people mobilise under the banner of Take Back the City. These are people who are protesting about the large volume of empty properties that we have both in Dublin and also in other cities. These are predominantly young people who can be described now as the locked out generation, because they are locked out. They're locked out of the prospect of having independent housing, whether to rent or to buy. This young generation find it impossible to access housing. Rents nationally are now 27% above the boom time high. In Dublin, rent for a one-bedroom apartment, for example, for a single person, in most parts of Dublin now, that rent represents over 50% of the person's take-home pay. It is entirely unsustainable. I mean, this is where a lot of the pressure is coming from for wage increases and a lot of the complaints about the cost of living. People simply cannot afford housing any longer, and certainly in relation to rent, they can't afford it. We're now in a never-ending upward spiral when it comes to rent, and it seems that government measures to date have been largely ineffective. As well as the unaffordability of rent, Tánaiste, this crisis is in turn having two other major impacts. It is clearly driving the homeless crisis, and it also means that home ownership is largely unattainable due to the impossibility of saving while paying these high rents, especially in a situation where so much of our housing is completely overpriced. Earlier this week, the Social Democrats called for an emergency two-year rent freeze. We believe that this would at least stop this spiral, and government has rejected this proposal. Now, Tánaiste, I'm asking you, at a time when the availability of rental properties is at an all-time low, it is really galling for people to get this kind of weak response from government. Why will you not consider, as an emergency measure, introducing a freeze on rents so that at least there's a bit of breathing space to allow some other measures to kick in? Can you explain your thinking in this regard, and what exactly is your argument against a rent freeze?
Thank you, Deputy Shortall. Tánaiste.
Yeah, Deputy. There's a lot of questions there, and I'd like to spend a lot of time answering them, because this is a brief that I'm very familiar with and still very involved in. But can I just answer your direct question on the rent freeze? I don't think it's a good idea, not because I don't want to introduce measures that provides relief for renters, but because the core of the problem here is a lack of supply. And we looked at this issue when we decided, for the first time in the history of the state, when I was a Minister for Housing, to effectively introduce rent caps in Ireland, which now apply to about 65% of all rental properties in the country, whereby there is a limit of no more than 4% of a rent increase per year linked to those properties, enforced by the system now. And we went through a long consultation process with all stakeholders, listening to people who are under pressure in terms of their rent, but also listening to people who want to invest in the rental market to provide more rental properties. And we shouldn't be making short-term decisions now that seem popular, but actually contribute significantly to limiting supply. And instead, what we need is an appropriate response where rents are high, to keep a cap on rental inflation, which is what is happening with rent pressure zones, that is getting the balance right between ensuring that while we build a lot more social housing, a lot more affordable housing, and while the private sector also delivers a lot more housing including affordable housing, that actually we continue to see that momentum for supply growth and that we don't shut it off by introducing dramatic measures that will undermine the confidence in the willingness to invest in the property market. And in my view, that is what a rent freeze across the country you're talking about now. You're calling for rent freeze everywhere, even in parts of the country where rents aren't particularly high at the moment. And you need to target areas where there's real heat and real pressure. That is what rent pressure zones and the criteria around rent pressure zones does. And we know that it's working in terms of the stats. The real problem in this market is supply. And we are addressing the supply issue. But it is going to take some time because you can't build houses overnight. And so we need to protect renters as we are doing and will continue to do while the pressure is as it is. But we also need to ensure that we deal with the supply challenge, because ultimately that is the solution here.
Important issue, but what the government is completely ignoring is the issue of affordability. And there are measures available to you as government to address this issue of affordability, and unfortunately you're dodging those because you're too reliant on the market and you're not prepared to intervene to the extent that it will make a real difference in people's lives. You know perfectly well, Tánaiste, that as the person who introduced the rent caps and the rent pressure zones, that they are of limited effect. They don't apply right around the country. In Limerick, for example, rents went up by 21% last year alone. In Waterford, they went up by 19%. And you know that there are plenty of loopholes in those measures, which enable landlords to dodge their responsibilities. They're not effective in the way that I believe you intended, but face the reality, they're not effective. You also talked about the willingness to invest. There isn't a willingness to invest on the part of a lot of developers, because what they're doing is they're sitting on land banks, waiting for prices to go up further, aided and abetted by your government. You know, look, the rent pressure measures aren't working. Derelict sites register is at a meaningless 3% on vacant properties. The vacant site levy is not effective. You know, introduced by Deputy Kelly, not effective, because in a situation where property values are going up so much, house prices are going up by 10%, what difference does a 3% levy make? Tánaiste, it's time for action, and meaningful action, and less of the talk.
Deputy, it is time for action and less talk. And that is why we are implementing the Rebuilding Ireland plan, which is a 5-year housing plan, which is working. You talk about the vacant site levy not working. Sure, the vacant site levy is only just starting. It doesn't work overnight. So you can't retrospectively correct things from 2 years ago. What we're doing is we are setting about in the.
Can we allow the Tánaiste to respond, please, Deputy Shortall?
You don't want to hear the answers. That's the problem, because you want to keep talking about the problems. We recognise in government that there are huge pressures on the housing market right now, and that is impacting families right across the country, but in particular in Dublin and Cork and Limerick and Galway and Waterford, but in other areas too. And we are setting about fixing those. There are specific responses around homelessness that are getting more and more money and resources, and that's what's needed. And a change in policy there, shifting towards housing first models and so on, which we know are working. 5,000 people were taken out of homelessness last year. We know that last year, in terms of social housing, that 7,000 new social housing units were added to the market last year. It'll be 8,000 this year. It'll be 10,000 and 12,000 in the years ahead. We know that last year 14,500 new homes were built in Ireland. This year it'll be over 20,000. 2 years ago that figure was less than 10,000. So we are moving in the right direction here, and while the transition is happening, we need to protect renters in particular and people who need affordable properties, which is why we've changed the rental market. But you don't want to recognise progress.
Thank you very much.
You want to keep talking about problems.
That concludes leaders' questions.